If you've never had 12 lives depending on one sentence coming out of your mouth, then it's hard to explain why a man would risk his career over something nobody else could even feel. The morning they laughed at me, they said I'd been sitting in that fire lookout too long, that 23 seasons on the same mountain had turned every little breeze into a disaster in my head. 18 minutes later, the exact ridge they refused to clear disappeared behind a wall of flame, and the only reason 12 firefighters went home that night was because one crew boss decided to trust an old man everyone else had stopped listening to. My name is Calvin Rhodes, and for most people I was just the guy in the glass tower on top of Granite Peak, staring through binoculars while everyone else did the real work. That's how they saw it anyway. What they never understood was that the mountain talks, not with words, but with smoke that leans a little farther than it should. Pine needles that suddenly stop moving, birds that vanish without making a sound, and wind that changes its mind before anyone down below ever feels it. After 23 years watching the same valleys wake up every morning, I knew those conversations better than I knew most people. That afternoon started like hundreds before it. The fire had been chewing through dead timber for 2 days, slow enough that everyone figured we had it boxed in. Crews were cutting line along the west ridge. Helicopters were making clean drops. Command sounded relaxed over the radio, even joking now and then. I remember pouring another cup of burnt coffee and thinking maybe we'd finally get lucky for once. Then I noticed the smoke. It wasn't the column itself, it was the edge. It leaned, hesitated, then curled back uphill. I set the coffee down without taking another sip. I grabbed my weather meter and checked it twice because I honestly hoped I was wrong. Wind had shifted 11 miles an hour and backed uphill. That wasn't just another breeze. Around these mountains, that kind of shift could turn a manageable fire into something that outran trucks, aircraft, and men on foot. I kept watching. Then I saw it. Tiny glowing embers floating far beyond where they had any business landing. They weren't dropping straight anymore. They were riding the wind across the canyon. Most people would have called them harmless sparks. I'd seen enough summers to know those little sparks could become a 100-foot wall of fire before anyone had time to unzip a shelter. I reached for the radio. Command, pull the crew off West Spur immediately. The wind just backed uphill. I'm seeing embers crossing the canyon. There was a pause, then a chuckle that wasn't even trying to hide itself. Calvin, you've been in that tower all week. We're not pulling a hotshot crew because you caught a breeze. I closed my eyes for half a second. I'd heard that tone before. It wasn't anger, it was worse. It was confidence. The kind that convinces people experience is just another opinion. This isn't a guess, I said, keeping my voice steady because panic never helps anyone. The fire isn't going to stay on that line. It's going to jump the canyon. Negative. Hold your post and keep watching. I looked through the binoculars again. Another ember landed. Then another. Tiny flashes disappearing into dry brush almost a quarter-mile ahead of the main fire. They were too small for anyone on the ground to notice, but from up there they looked like someone striking matches in the distance. I logged the exact time in my notebook out of habit. 2017 p.m. Maybe habit isn't the right word. Maybe it was instinct. If everything went wrong, I wanted there to be a record that somebody had seen it coming. Down below, crew boss Erin Walker was leading 12 firefighters along the ridge. I'd worked with Erin before. She wasn't reckless, and she wasn't stubborn just to prove a point. She listened, something that had become surprisingly rare. I switched frequencies. Technically, I wasn't supposed to bypass command, and I knew exactly how much trouble that could bring if I was wrong. Erin, this is Lookout 1, she answered immediately. Go ahead, Calvin. I need you off that ridge, right now. Get your people into the burn scar below and stay there. There was silence for a moment before she answered carefully. Command hasn't released us. I swallowed hard because I knew what I was about to say could end my career if this fire behaved the way everyone else expected it to. Then let them write me up tomorrow. I'm releasing you with the only view on this mountain that sees the whole picture. Move now. Don't wait for permission. I could almost hear her thinking through the static. Around her I caught faint sounds of chainsaws, shovels scraping dirt, somebody laughing about dinner when this shift was over. Ordinary sounds, the kind that disappear forever when a fire turns faster than people can run. Finally Erin spoke again, calm as ever. All right, Calvin, we're moving. I watched 12 tiny figures peel away from the ridge, heading toward the blackened ground they'd already burned over that morning. Down at command, somebody was probably already furious that I'd gone around the chain of command. Honestly, I didn't care anymore. I wasn't trying to win an argument. I was trying to make sure 12 families didn't get a phone call before sunset. And deep down, as the smoke leaned a little farther with every passing minute, I had a feeling the mountain hadn't finished talking yet. For a few seconds, nothing happened. And that's the cruelest part about making the right decision too early. It makes everyone who doubted you feel smarter with every passing minute. I kept my binoculars trained on the ridge while Erin and her crew disappeared into the black. That stretch of already burned ground firefighters jokingly called the safest, ugly place on the mountain. Down at Incident Command, I could almost picture Operations Chief Derek Nolan shaking his head, probably telling the others that the old lookout had finally let his imagination outrun his judgment. I'd worked with Derek for years. He wasn't a bad man. He was organized, disciplined, respected by everyone under him. But somewhere along the way, he'd started believing that every fire could be managed with checklists, computer models, and yesterday's predictions. Mountains don't care about yesterday. They rewrite the rules whenever they want. I watched another ember drift over the canyon, then another, and suddenly one didn't disappear. It stayed, just a tiny orange dot, tucked beneath a stand of dry fir trees. I leaned closer against the glass. "Come on," I whispered to myself. The dot grew brighter, then vanished behind a pocket of smoke. 5 seconds later, another flare appeared 20 yards uphill. Spot fire. Exactly where I'd expected it. My hand was already reaching for the radio before my brain finished processing what my eyes were seeing. Command. Spot fire established across the canyon. Repeat. You've got ignition ahead of the main front. This time nobody laughed. Derek answered almost immediately. "We're checking." Checking. That one word told me everything. They still thought there was time. They still believed confirmation mattered more than action. The mountain wasn't waiting for confirmation. I looked back toward Erin's crew. They had almost reached the burn scar, moving at a steady pace without running. That was another reason I respected her. Panic spreads faster than fire. Calm keeps people alive. One of the younger firefighters glanced over his shoulder at the ridge they'd just left, probably wondering why they were abandoning hours of hard work. I imagined the conversations happening below. Somebody complaining they were giving up, good line. Somebody joking that Calvin had seen a ghost in the wind again. Then the mountain answered for me. It started with a roar so low I couldn't hear it through the glass, but I could see it. Every tree crown bent at once as if an invisible hand shoved the entire forest uphill. The smoke column folded over itself. Flames that had been creeping suddenly stretched into long orange ribbons racing through the timber. "There it goes," I muttered. The spot fire exploded almost instantly, joining the main front like two rivers crashing together. Then the impossible became inevitable. Fire leaped the canyon in one violent surge, climbed the opposite slope faster than a pickup could drive it, and rolled directly across the very section of ridge where Erin's crew had been digging line less than 20 minutes earlier. It wasn't dramatic the way movies make it look. It was worse, faster, colder somehow. 1 second there was a forest. The next there was nothing but a moving wall of orange swallowing everything in front of it. I watched burning trees collapse across the trail where those 12 firefighters would have been standing, and I felt my stomach tighten because no amount of experience ever makes you comfortable seeing how close death can come. The radio finally exploded with voices talking over each other. "Fire crossed the ridge. We've lost the line. Account for all crews." Somebody yelled for aircraft. Somebody else started calling escape routes. Derek's voice cut through the chaos. "Erin? Status." There was a pause that felt like an hour. Then her voice came back, breathing hard but perfectly controlled. "Crew accounted for. 12 present. We're secure in the black." I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until I let it out. 12 present. Those 2 words weighed more than every medal the Forest Service could have handed me. Down below, engines started pulling back while helicopters banked away from the heat column. Nobody cared anymore about whose authority had been challenged. Survival has a funny way of settling arguments. 20 minutes later, Derek drove up the access road to the tower. I saw his truck before he climbed the stairs. He wasn't the kind of man who hurried, but that afternoon, he took those steps 2 at a time. When he opened the tower door, neither of us spoke right away. We just stood there looking through the glass at the ridge still burning in the distance. Finally, he asked, almost quietly, "What made you call it?" I kept watching the smoke. "The wind changed before it reached you." He nodded once. Weather station didn't show that until after the run started, because the weather station isn't sitting 400 feet above the canyon watching the smoke lean. He looked down at my notebook lying open beside the radio. The page showed one simple entry. 2017 p.m., wind backs uphill. Embers Crossing. Recommend immediate withdrawal from West Spur. Derek stared at the handwriting for several seconds before asking, "You write everything down?" I smiled a little. "Only the things people won't believe later." He didn't answer. Instead, he picked up the binoculars and looked toward the ridge that no longer existed. If Aaron had stayed, he never finished the sentence. He didn't need to. We both knew how that story would have ended. Before sunset, the investigation team had already started collecting radio recordings, weather logs, GPS tracks, and dispatch notes. That's what happens after every major fire. Every decision gets pulled apart piece by piece, not because people are looking for heroes, but because they're trying to make sure the next crew has a better chance than the last one. I sat quietly while technicians downloaded data from the weather station, and one of the younger analysts wandered into the tower carrying a tablet. He couldn't have been older than 26. "Mr. Rhodes," he said, "your radio transmission came in 2 minutes before our instruments recorded the shift." I shrugged. "The mountain recorded it first." He laughed politely, thinking I was joking. I wasn't. By the following morning, the replay told the entire story without anyone adding a single opinion. At 2:17, my warning. 2 minutes later, official weather confirmation. 16 minutes after that, the ridge overrun. Every timestamp fit together like pieces of a puzzle nobody wanted to admit had already been solved before the fire made its move. Erin stopped by the tower before heading home. Her face was covered in soot except for the pale lines left by safety glasses, and she carried her helmet under one arm. "I owe you a beer," she said. I chuckled. "Make it coffee. I'm too old to climb these stairs with a hangover." She laughed. Then her smile faded. "One of my rookies asked why I listened to you instead of command." I looked out across the valley where fresh smoke still drifted through the evening light. "What'd you tell him?" She rested her elbows on the railing outside the tower. "I told him there are people who know the rules, and there are people who know the mountain. Every once in a while, those aren't the same person." I didn't answer because I wasn't sure I deserved the compliment. The truth was simpler than that. I wasn't smarter than anyone else. I'd just spent enough years paying attention to little things most people stopped noticing. Sometimes experience isn't about knowing more. It's about ignoring less. As the sun dropped behind the western peaks, I noticed another ribbon of smoke beginning to lean over a completely different drainage, so faint that nobody down below would have given it a second glance. I quietly reached for my binoculars again, because something deep in my gut told me this day wasn't finished, and the mountain still had one more lesson left to teach. The next morning, the newspapers talked about aggressive fire behavior, unpredictable weather, and how close the crews had come to disaster. But they never mentioned the 18 minutes that made all the difference. They never wrote about the argument over the radio, or the old lookout everyone thought had become too cautious after spending half his life alone above the trees. That's usually how these stories go. The headlines celebrate the ending, not the quiet decisions that prevented something far worse from ever happening. By noon, the review team had finished comparing every radio transmission with the weather data, satellite records, and GPS tracks. Nobody had to exaggerate anything because the facts spoke loudly enough on their own. My warning had been logged before the official instruments recognized the wind shift. The spot fire had started almost exactly where I'd marked it on my map. The main run had crossed the ridge within a few yards of the location I'd called over the radio. Those weren't lucky guesses. They were 23 years of paying attention to details most people never realized mattered until it was too late. A week later, I was asked to sit in on the after-action review. Those meetings are usually uncomfortable because everyone is looking for mistakes, and nobody enjoys having their decisions replayed in front of an entire room. Derek stood up before anyone else could begin pointing fingers. "I made the wrong call," he said without trying to soften it. "I dismissed field experience because I trusted procedure more than observation. If Calvin hadn't gone around me, we'd probably be reading 12 names instead of writing 12 evaluations. You could have heard a pin drop." Nobody expected a division chief to admit something like that in front of his peers. Then Aaron leaned forward and added something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. "Command gives orders," she said, "but trust keeps people alive. Sometimes the bravest decision isn't following the chain of command. It's knowing when the mountain has already overruled it." Nobody applauded. Nobody needed to. The silence carried more respect than clapping ever could. Over the next few months, the incident became part of training for new firefighters across the district. They didn't use my name very often, and honestly, I preferred it that way. What mattered was the lesson. Young lookouts were taught to document every observation, Crew leaders were encouraged to listen when someone with years of local experience raised concerns, and one new sentence quietly found its way into the daily safety briefing. If wind behavior changes before ground crews can verify it, reassess immediately. Reading those words for the first time felt strange because they weren't really mine. They belonged to every firefighter who never made it home because somebody recognized the danger just a little too late. As for me, life returned to what it had always been. Most mornings started before sunrise with a thermos of coffee that was never quite hot enough, an old pair of binoculars that had more scratches than I cared to count, and miles of forest slowly waking beneath the first light. People sometimes asked if I ever got tired of sitting alone in a glass tower. I'd smile and tell them loneliness isn't so bad when you've spent enough years learning the language of the wind. Every day the mountain teaches you something new, if you're willing to stop talking long enough to listen. Looking back now, I don't think that day was really about proving I was right or proving someone else was wrong. It was about humility. Nature doesn't care how many badges you wear, how many meetings you've led, or how confident you sound over a radio. The mountain doesn't negotiate, and fire has no interest in our pride. Sometimes the smallest warning becomes the biggest truth, and sometimes the quietest voice in the room is the one everyone should hear first. Even now, every time I see smoke leaning a little farther than it should, I still feel that knot in my stomach. Because experience doesn't erase fear, it simply teaches you to respect it. And every now and then, I wonder what would have happened if Erin had waited just one more minute for official permission. If she decided that paperwork mattered more than instinct, or if I had stayed quiet because I didn't want people laughing at me again, 12 families would have lived a completely different story. Maybe that's why I still believe speaking up is worth the risk, even when nobody wants to hear it. So now I'd like to ask you something. Do you think I was right to bypass the chain of command, knowing I could have lost my career if I'd been wrong? Or should rules always come before instinct, no matter how much experience someone has? Let me know down in the comments because I'd genuinely like to hear where you stand on that question. And if this story reminded you that courage sometimes sounds a lot quieter than people expect, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes experience still matters. You never know whose voice might save lives the next time the wind decides to change.